Welcome back, brave listeners, to the second part of our Tales of the Damned. I am your nameless host, and when we last left our story, Lily had received grave news about her lover, and Simon was settling into his new role at the eerie Bleakheart Manor. Following the news, Lily had retreated to her room and locked the door. She didn't want to face the world anymore. She had spent the last year exchanging letters with a man she loved, believing each day that he was getting closer to returning to her, that soon she would be wed, and that she'd have a beautiful family in a beautiful mansion with a beautiful man. But fate had said no. That was not to be her life. Those dreams would not come to fruition, and so Lily relegated herself to her chambers. A doctor was immediately called, the family fearing she had come down with some malady rather than accepting she had succumbed to grief. All the whilst, Simon silently wished there was something he could do for her. There was not much he could immediately do, even if he could. As the household was preparing for a long and isolated winter, the next days were spent assisting the staff in stocking the pantries, gathering firewood, and securing the manor in some of the older parts, like the small chapel that looked unlikely to be used anytime soon. It was arduous work and afforded Simon little time to think, but he was grateful in getting the chance to have a more thorough look around the manor to help out in more ways. And helping out more was something he would have to do. Heavy snowfall was expected for the coming month, and many of the servants who lived in the nearby village were given permission to remain in their homes and not worry about their duties at Bleakheart. This did leave certain jobs vacant, and as it would be unlikely that the manor would be receiving any visitors during this time, the master had approached Simon with the news that he would do more around the house. He would still stay in the hut unless his presence in the manor was utterly necessary. But he was afforded with a thicker woolen blanket to keep him warm during the night. The horse-drawn carriage rattled up slowly along the stone path, moving at a steady pace to avoid any mishaps on the icy patches, and pulled up to the manor's grand entrance. Simon helped the well-dressed man alight from the carriage and rang for the master. It was the doctor, who had come as promptly as possible, knowing the family would pay well for his quick services. The master came down and met with him before leading him towards Lily's room. Simon was left in charge of bringing in the doctor's belongings. It seemed he would be staying overnight. As he was moving the baggage from the carriage to the foyer, Simon could hear the faintest whisper in his ears. The clock chimed. He focused on his duty. The whisper turned into a cacophony of voices, all clamoring to gain his attention, and Simon could no longer ignore them. He looked up to the balcony, and there he could see the figure standing, looking down at him. He raced up the stairs. The figure turned and walked down the corridor. He duly followed. The figure stepped through an open door, and a few moments later, Simon stepped through too. I'll have to observe her for a few days to get a proper indication of what is afflicting her, came the cordial words of the doctor.
Of course, we've prepared a room for you to stay in, naturally,
responded the hearty voice of the father. Very good. The doctor stood up and looked at Simon. Are you here to chaperone me already?
Ah, Simon, when did you get here?
The master asked, slightly perturbed, but much more distracted by the bed-stricken Lily.
It doesn't matter. Show Brian to the downstairs guest room, would you?
Simon stood looking at Lily. She was propped up in her bed, Mother sitting down by her left side and holding her hand, as the three men looked on from in front of the bed. Her father had a grim expression on his face as he contemplated a piece of paper in his hands. Taking a cursory look around her room, he noticed the music box sitting on top of a dressing table. Well, the doctor insisted, nudging Simon back into the moment. He dutifully nodded and led Brian to his chambers for the night. The snowfall was heavy that night as winter gripped the grounds in its icy clutches. Winds howling around the manor, shaking and rattling the trees. Simon was glad of his woolen blanket, but as soon as the dawn was breaking, he was lighting a candle and getting dressed immediately so that he may seek proper warmth in the manor. It was a struggle to make it across even the relatively short distance between his hut and the entrance, as snow had built up to shin height, as evidenced by the wading motion he had to adopt to move across the blanket of snow. Helping with the kitchen duties gave Simon the chance to sit with Lily once in a while as he poured her tea or laid out her meals for her. She wasn't as talkative or bright as she had been when they first met, the color looking as though it had been drained from her, and her eyes had sunken into her skull with how sullen they were. She must have wept every night ever since getting the news. But still, he came and he sat with her and kept her company. Sometimes he would bring the books he was borrowing from the library with him and read out loud the finer details of ship construction or chapters of Milton's Paradise Lost. He wouldn't stay for long as he had other errands to attend to, but also because the music box made him feel on edge. It unsettled him. He'd still hear it being wound up and played out, although not quite so frequently, and never whilst he was in the room. But the tune would find itself playing in his head for hours. The doctor, who had come to stay, was trying an assortment of methods to find a cure or solution to her physical well-being. Her father insisted that medicine could solve the issue. Simon understood more of what was happening. It was grief. She had her dreams taken so abruptly from her. After another day of watching Brian prod and probe her with his medical equipment, Simon resolved to speak about this with the master.
You think it's because she's sad?
Scoffed the master. Yes, I do, Simon said defiantly. She's lost everything she's had hoped for. She's lost her future and her lover. How could she not be sad?
Don't be ridiculous. If it was sadness, she would have moved on from that by now.
The master dismissed Simon and went back to setting the dinner room table. Incensed by this, the young man placed his hands on the table. Sadness can take root deep inside. This isn't something that will go away in a few days. Perhaps it may never truly leave her, Simon impassionately cried back, startling the master, who quickly regained his composure.
If it's love she needs,
Came the voice of Mr. Bleakheart as he entered the room, making his presence known.
then she won't have to worry about that much longer. We've got a suitor lined up for her, and her marriage will be happening before the summer, as planned.
There was silence between the three of them. Who was Simon to argue with Lily's father, the man who ultimately gave him permission to even be in the house? He smoothed out the tablecloth that he had inadvertently screwed up with his clenched fists and stood up straight. Who have you found? Simon questioned.
The doctor, Brian. He's a fine man and has taken a liking to Lily during his short stay with us. I am hopeful that before the month's end she'll reciprocate his feelings. It would be best for our family and estate.
The bell for evening dinner rang, and Simon was called away by his duties in the kitchen before he could say anything to what he had just heard. It didn't feel right to bring it back up during dinner with Lily's mother, Brian, and a few other servants all attending. Instead, he swallowed it, keeping it to himself. He could do naught but watch as Brian made advances on Lily over the following days. He had become much more aware of his intentions now that he knew what was happening. What seemed like daily routine checkups became excruciating moments. Then came the proposal. Everyone present in the snowed-in manor had gathered in Lily's room for an important announcement from Mr. Bleakheart. They had tried to move Lily from her chambers, but the closest they could get her to leaving was a few paces from the door before she would go rushing back to the comfort of the music box. Simon had attended despite already knowing what the topic would be.
As you know, Brian has been our esteemed guest for the past 2 weeks. He has diligently been working to find out a way to help our poor Lily overcome her recent malady. And in that time, I have seen a connection bloom. A deep connection between the two of them. One that I would like to honor. That is why today, in front of all of you, I am formally offering the hand of my daughter, Lily, to that of Brian. There were a few astonished gasps from those gathered, many of which faked. Brian stood, understanding it was his turn to respond.
Though, yes, it has only been a short time, Brian spoke with an almost smirk in his voice. It would humbly please me to wed your daughter, Mr. Bleakheart. I graciously accept.
Lily cried out. It was unclear she fully knew what she was reacting to, as she had been in a trance-like state for many weeks now, not showing much attention to the world around her. But now she was awake and full of rage. She thrashed about in her bed, so much so that the master and Mr. Bleakheart rushed to restrain her down against the mattress of her bed. Simon couldn't bear the sight and left the room, heading to the library at a quickening pace. This is wrong, he kept thinking to himself. Why are they doing this? The thoughts raced around his head as he entered the quiet room that had shelves stuffed with all sorts of books. He went straight to the section about shipbuilding. From what he had gathered during his time both in the manor and in the library was that the Bleakheart's fortune was partially built upon commerce and trade, with an earlier member of the family branching out into shipments. There were all sorts of books and information on trade routes, on types of ships and what they could be used for. And this fueled Simon's imagination about dealing with these types of entrepreneuring individuals, of designing grand ships for them to explore the new world with. He sighed and brought a heavy fist down against one of the shelves. A book loosened from amongst them, tumbling to the floor with a soft thud. He picked it up and turned it around in his hands. It wasn't particularly heavy, nor was it very decorative, with nothing distinguishing about it on its cover, nor title, no author. All there was a padlock keeping prying eyes from absorbing the contents. Had this book been here all this time? It seemed personal in some way. That sound. The chiming of the clock. Simon was alert. Who was that in the doorway? He snapped around to face them, catching a glimpse of their cloaked figure moving past the frame. He followed suit. In the darkness, the manor's halls, he caught only glimpses of the cloaked stranger as they darted around the corners and just out of sight. Simon became more frantic to catch up with them. He heard sounds of arguing, raised voices pitched with anger and frustration as he chased the phantom. He found himself at the bottom of the stairs in the foyer. He knew where this was going.
Without a moment's hesitation, he climbed the stairs with great speed, aware of the presence watching him from above. When he reached the summit, they stood before him. The sound of the clock was clearer this time. The red door was opened, yellow flickering candlelight pouring out. The figure entered. "I've got you," he thought to himself as he entered after them. The room was bright, his vision blurred. He could make out the rough shapes of a square table, a fireplace, and a sofa. The sound drew his attention to the grand drawing room clock by which the figure stood, back turned to him. He approached, unaware of how he was gripping the mysterious journal in his hands, raising it high with each step until he brought it down. Simon woke at his desk in his little room, stirred by the sensation of how cold he was. He rubbed his arms to give himself a bit of warmth. What was he doing here? He looked around. The drawer in the desk was open, and sitting on top of some disheveled papers was a key. What was that doing there? He closed the drawer and stumbled into the cover of the blanket, where he then passed out once again. Months had passed since the doctor had vanished without a trace. At first it was thought that he'd merely missed an appointment, perhaps keeping to himself to get over a brief illness. But the worry built up as the days went on without any sign of his presence. Frost remained as the snow melted away, revealing once more the grass and earth that lay buried underneath. Aside from the winter air, the house felt much more cold now, more barren, as if something had slowly been taken from it. As Simon stepped out to greet the defrosting world, he was soon met with the gruesome sight of Brian's body lying dead. Blood that had poured out from his ears had frozen solid. How had they missed this? His body must have been buried deep under the blanket of snow, concealing it from sight. He must have fallen from a height, judging from the contorted position of his body. And so Simon looked up for any kind of clue. The only room high enough to result in such an injury was Lily's room. That couldn't be right. How or why would he have fallen from up there? A small procession was held for Brian in the chapel at the back of the manor. His body had been cleaned up, and he had been given a simple wooden coffin which had been buried on nearby grounds. These events perturbed Mr. Bleakheart, now more desperate to resolve the issue with Lily. Having found no solution in conventional medicine, he resolved to find one by other means. Now that it was possible to move to and from the manor, he was able to leave and find someone appropriate. Someone who the family had had dealings with in the past. As the villagers returned to the manor to take over their duties once more, Simon tried to talk to them about the erratic behavior of the family. Many were concerned for the well-being of Lily, but none would speculate on what was happening, instead choosing to change the subject or leave entirely when the possibility of discussing the family history was brought up. Simon was confused by this. He had always held the family and the manor in high regard, and given what he had learned of them, he considered them to be a good influence on the local area. The family may be strange, but they had their reasons for it. Reasons he was more determined to uncover. There must be something in the library that explains more, he mused to himself. Suddenly, the image of the odd book flashed into his mind. Maybe that had something to do with it. But it was locked. He'd have no hope of finding the key to it. Unless... The house fell quiet again for another night, and on hurried feet Simon made his way back to the library, bringing with him a candle in one hand and the key from the drawer in the other. It seemed highly unlikely, but it was worth a shot. Once again entering the library, he scoured the shelves for the signs of the book. He'd had no recollection of what he had done with it, if he had returned it or kept it. He knew it wasn't in his room. No, he checked there just in case before he came out. It took some time, but eventually he found it nestled in tightly amongst a row of messy books, removed it with a bit of a struggle, and took it over to a small reading desk. The moment of truth. He brought the key to the lock and dubiously inserted it. He turned. It opened. The book's secrets were revealed to him. He tenuously flicked through the pages, glancing over them. Many were full of illegible scrawl, as it appeared to be written by someone with a cursory understanding of how to write. From this he could assume the book was a journal or diary of sorts, much like what he was keeping back in his own room. But who had this belonged to? Scanning through, he found an interesting passage, one accusing Jacob Bleakheart of treachery. He read on and discovered more about the man who started the Bleakheart family, one whose rise to power was filled with cold-hearted deceit and deception. He would take any means necessary to build his fortune, from having rivals murdered to using his children as leverage to gain status with more prolific families. His lust for power and uncaring attitude to those around him earned him the nickname of Bleakheart. In time, tempers rose from the local villagers, and they took up arms to show their disdain for Jacob Bleakheart. The author of the journal never spoke in certain terms about what became of him, varying wildly with accusations of being buried under the manor, to sailing off in distant shrouded lands, or he was simply murdered by his own kin. Simon slammed the book shut. Mr. Bleakheart returned just 3 days after his departure, bringing with him the wise woman. She held herself with an air of elegance and piety, her clothes strange and ragged, walking barefoot, and around her waist was a pouch, covered in runes and a skull. Her long black hair flowed unevenly as it framed her face. Perhaps the most immediately striking feature about her was her pitch black eyes, a dark liquid seemingly ever dripping from them. She calmly took in the atmosphere and spoke.
This place. There are many spirits here, but you have not called me here to exorcise them, but rather to free one from the grasp of something unknown. Show me to her.
She was duly escorted by the master and Mr. Bleakheart to Lily's chambers. A few of the staff tagged along behind, waiting outside whilst the woman went about her business. Simon was amongst their number.
Yes, very troubling indeed.
The woman, who went by the name Madame Ostera, muttered. She had walked about Lily's room very briefly before honing in on the music box, taking far greater interest in that trinket than anything else.
There is a sorrow here. It is resonating with Lily, and it is not allowing her to move on. And yet, I sense yearning from her. I propose we do a ritual to purify her.
Mr. Bleakheart was hesitant. It was clear by the inflection of his voice. A ritual here?
No, not here,
she dismissed, turning her attention to Lily.
Girl, do you wish to see your lover again? I believe I can give you the chance to say goodbye.
Lily rose to this. The prospect of seeing Brennan again ignited something in her.
What must I do?
Led by Madame Ostera, they all gathered in the drawing room. Lily's parents, the master, several servants, and even Simon. Simon was uncomfortable being in this room, his skin becoming itchy and irritated by simply being in there. He tried his best to downplay his discomfort. Luckily for him, all eyes were on Lily, who had for the first time in several months taken steps outside of her room, though she had insisted on wearing what would have been her wedding dress. She sat at the small square table opposite Madame Ostera. On the table itself was the music box, a few glyphs drawn on stones that were scattered about, and a tea set, all set out nicely on an ornate tablecloth. The pot of tea itself had been specially brewed by Ostera for this occasion. She poured out a measured amount into the teacup set before Lily.
I willingly undertake this ritual so that I may once more see my beloved,
declared Lily, entirely of her own power, bringing the teacup to her lips. With no hesitation, she supped deep on the enchanted broth. The wind howling outside on the grounds of the manor, barraging the walls with all its might. The master and Lily's mother looked at each other with unease. It took a few moments for any visible effects to appear. Ostera had already assured them it would take some time. She shuddered, she shook, and all the color drained from her face. The wind fell silent. Emerging abruptly from someplace deep within her came a blood-curdling screech, one that woke the whole manor and lasted for several agonizing seconds, ringing in the heads of all those present. Lily's mother attempted to calm her, grasping her by her shoulders. "What is happening to my daughter?" cried the father, demanding to understand.
We must allow this to happen. We must allow the other side to connect through,
reassured Ostera. The worst was yet to come, as Lily flailed in her seat, grasping at the air and all around her as if some otherworldly being was tormenting her. In her frenzy, she had caught the elaborately decorated cloth that ordained the table and threw it toward the open fireplace, dragging along with it all of the contents on the table. Mr. Bleakheart rushed to catch the cloth but fumbled, tripping over his own feet. The teapot shattered against the floor as the music box was flung into the fire, causing the flames to flare up as if eager to consume the dark spirit attached. Lily saw something in the flames and clambered with all her might to reach it, knocking over the table as she stood.
Brennan!
Ethereal screams tore through the room, shrill and laughing, joining with Lily's screech to create a cacophony of unholy sounds. As Lily stood in the flames, engulfed by their heat, as they burned through the frail wedding dress, she lowered her veil. The rest of the room was a blur of motion, painted in bold hues of orange and yellow as the fire grew. There was nothing that could be done. Everyone who was able fled the room. First to flee was the master, shortly joined by Lily's father, who had pulled himself up off the floor by way of using the drawing room clock as leverage, causing it to fall with a resounding clang of gears being shuffled out of place. Shortly after came her mother, and then the various staff. Ostera tried her best to channel some inner energy to settle the spirits as the flames rose mockingly around her. Simon waited as long as he could before getting out, covering his mouth with his sleeve as smoke was beginning to build up. He took one look back into the room to see Lily standing, grasping at the locket that was now torn from her neck. She looked to him and mouthed one last sentence before Simon was knocked backward and off the balcony by a sudden burst of flame. The blaze engulfed the drawing room and swiftly grew to the foyer, rolling down the stairs and along corridors to the remaining wings without any resistance. In an instant, the house was lost. There was nothing the residents could do to stop this righteous flame that seemed hell-bent on reducing Bleakheart Manor to ash. Everyone who could make it out of the manor made their way to the gates of the estate, only to then look back in horror as it collapsed in on itself in a sea of flames. Simon awake, head throbbing in an unknown bed. He was told that he had been pulled from the manor by a few of the servants who had spotted him on their way out, and that he had been taken back to the village when they'd gone to investigate what had happened when they saw the fire light up the sky. He spent a few days recuperating in the home of a family friend before deciding to seek out the Bleakhearts. They were still alive, also staying in the village for the time being whilst they sort out their affairs. Simon approached Mr. Bleakheart.
You awake now? Almost managed to stay the full period, hmm?
His words were heavy.
We'll still pay you, don't you worry. We know you wanted to do what you could for our daughter too. We were just too late.
I'm sorry about what happened.
Simon began solemnly. Mr. Bleakheart waved him off.
My wife tells me you have an interest in the nautical. Something about wanting to design ships.
Mr. Bleakheart grunted as he turned to look Simon in the eyes.
She'd said you'd been reading our books on the subject and drawing up plans. Take this. Show it to some friends of mine. It'll get you started.
He produced a small letter addressed to a name Simon recognized.
Thank you, sir.
He accepted the gift with gratitude, bowing deeply. This genuine act seemed to make Mr. Bleakheart uncomfortable for a brief moment. Almost 1 year following the blaze that tore through the manor, Simon returned. The house had lain dormant since those events, abandoned by the family and by the locals. To many it was a cursed place, full of suffering, whilst others swore they could hear the sounds of a music box playing and gentle weeping, and that was enough to keep them away. As for Simon, on Mr. Bleakheart's recommendation, he had joined a large shipbuilding company, where he had worked diligently up the ranks. With the wealth he had saved up, it was time to repay a debt. He recalled Lily's last words, "Find him," and had become determined to see them out and to honor her memory. And so that was why he came back. He had returned to see what parts of the manor could be salvaged, what inspiration could be gleaned. He would commission a large ship and continue the legacy of Bleakheart Manor in a new form, and he would seek out the whereabouts of Lily's lover. Searching through the broken doorways and remnants of rooms, he found Lily's locket amongst the rubble. Unaware of the veiled specter that stood watching him from behind, he bent down and picked up the locket and placed it in his pocket. Satisfied with this discovery, he returned to the carriage. This locket, this pure symbol of their love, would serve as the basis for the design of the shape. He thought to himself as he turned over the ivory trinket in his hands, admiring the delicate gold detailing. As he stepped into the carriage to leave the manor's grounds for the last time in his life, he looked back and thought about the future. He would reach the SeaOfThieves, and he would find Brennan. Little did he know that Lily wouldn't be far from him either. And so that brings an end to our Tales of the Damned. Now that you know the history of Bleakheart Manor and of the Bleakheart Banshee, if you ever go sailing and see amidst the fog a ship flying the Bleakheart colors, spare a thought for the lover lost to grief, searching for her dearest.